One of our major objectives is to orientate all of our resources in the same direction, making them as easy on the eyes as possible from the perspective of the player of the guitar, who is of course located behind the guitar. Therefore, for example, my guitar is going to look like I'm playing left-handed, but no, we just flipped it around to mirror your perspective from behind your guitar as though you were playing it into a mirror. Similarly, our Excel spreadsheet will be representing the fretboard, this representing the low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling, top to bottom, left to right, orientated as though we just took our guitar and imprinted the strings on the screen. We're now going to be doing our interval practice around this F note using the same shape we've been using before, which we'll talk more about shortly, but that basically means we're going to be constructing a Lydian mode. So I want to go into a quick overview on why we're going to go through the exercise and why we would want to learn the Lydian mode in particular from the bottom of the guitar, noting that I know I've kind of reviewed this in the prior presentation, so I'm going to take a little bit different of a perspective here, focusing more on why we want to learn the mode numbering system and how that can help us basically build chords as we play in different modes other than in the major scale. So I'm going to try to focus a little bit more on that. So if I go back up top again, remember that we're compare everything to the major scale. And one of the problems, by the way, of comparing everything to the major scale in Western music is oftentimes people don't actually get away from the major scale because they've learned everything from the perspective of the major scale. What we want to be able to do is say the major scale is our Rosetta Stone. It's the thing, it's our home base. It's like a child that has their home base as their mom, right? And they kind of go around their mom, but they can then reach out further than that because they have the safe home to go back to, right? We want to do a similar thing where we're exploring outwards instead of being stuck within the same spot, because that's basically the safe zone. So that's going to be the thing that the tool that we use to learn basically the other modes from other perspectives. And so we can group things in our mind together, and that's going to be another concept that I think is really useful in music theory in general and in guitar in particular, that being, how can I pack as much information in my mind in a way that basically makes sense? Is it going to be rogue memory? Am I just going to rogue memorize like 300 scales? Possibly that's not the way you want to go. The way we want to go then usually is to relate things, link them in our mind to things we already know. That's why we tell stories. That's why we have the acronyms. And that's why we use analogies. So that's the way that I particularly try to think about how to add new information. I try to say, what do I know? How can I tack on the new information to what I know? How can I learn things in groups? So instead of learning 300 things, I learn them in groups, breaking them down to 100 things or something, right? It's a smaller number of things with groups. Well, we can, of course, learn these 7 scales by grouping them under the category of, in essence, the key of the major scale, because they have all the same notes. It's just a matter of where the starting point is within each of them. And that's one way that we can learn things. Now, the other way, when we look at the shapes, we can learn the fretboard by putting all those notes on the fretboard, breaking the fretboard out into basically 5 shapes, which perfectly fit my hand. That's why the guitar's built that way. And then we can name those shapes basically with a numbering system, or possibly the caged system, which is simply taking the open position shapes and moving them up the fretboard. But even the caged system for most people is designed based on the major scale, meaning if I'm going to call this shape, I would call it shape number 1, but if you name it by the caged system, you'd have to look for the related major scale, C major, and see that there's a G shape to make that C major. So it's a G-shaped major, a G-shaped C major position, right? But that makes it a little bit more difficult for me to say, well, what if I'm not playing in the major scale? What if I'm playing in Dorian or Phrygian or Lydian and so on and so forth? I want to be able to see that the same shape also can be representing any of the modes. It just depends on where we start the shape, because again, all the notes are the same. So then we, of course, can also learn by using what I call the formula, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, which once again, we always learn from the perspective of the major scale, oftentimes. And that's great, but I'd like to learn it from the other positions as well. So once again, I can start anywhere, not from the top of the shape. Now notice the benefit of learning the formula is that I'm not stuck to this shape then, right? I don't have to be in this shape. I can actually break out of the shape because I know the formula of whole, half, which is more easily seen on one string. Although you can see it on multiple strings if we know the distance between the two strings, being 5 notes typically, unless it's 4 notes between these two strings. So that gives us an ability to see the fretboard differently, possibly breaking out of these normal pattern boxes from time to time when we want to do that. We want to be able to switch our mind between those things. And then of course we can learn by interval, which is what we are doing now, which is particularly good. That means we're going to choose a point and measure around that point, which is particularly good for chord construction ideas. So that means that so if I learn this on the major, this shape then, we can usually see the shape. If I was to play it, I would call it shape number 1. So it's going to be, that would be pentatonic, 5 notes. That would be 7 notes. Usually if I play it that way, I'm playing from the A, which means I'm playing the related minor chord. And if I played it from the C, that would be the major. And that means that if I start on any point in here, I can think of it as any of these modes. If in essence, I think about the new tonic and I make that the tonic, any of these ones, the tonic. So that's why we can kind of pack all these shapes into one thing. Now, so you might think, well, what about the Lydian? Maybe I don't want to play in Lydian. Why would I want to learn the Lydian? Well, I want to emphasize the idea that we want to think about, in my mind, I'm trying to think about more of these modes as chords, right? Because even if I only play in like Ionian, the major scale, and Aeolian, the minor scale, I still want to know my full potential to play all the chords within that scale. So in other words, if I'm in the major scale, what are we going to do? We're going to say, here's the note in the major scale, all the colored notes. How do I know if I can build a chord off of those notes? Well, I know I can add a fifth almost all the time, so I can make a power chord almost all the time and add a fifth no matter which note in the scale I start from. That's great. But then when do I add the third? Because I want to add the third. Well, if it's the major scale, people start to memorize that the 1, 4, 5 are major chord constructions and therefore have a major third. The 2, 3, and 7, the 2, 3, and 6 have minor chord constructions, and then the 7 has a minor and a flat 5. So we start to kind of learn that in relation to the major scale. But that doesn't really convert too well if I go to the Dorian, and now I have my relative positions have all changed. So what would, and it's not too good for me to know anything beyond the third, because if all I know is that the 1, 4, 5 are major chord constructions, I don't know the difference between what I can do on the 1, 4, 5 from the perspective of a chord construction that is different, which would still have the same notes within the C major scale, right? Because once I get to the 7, 9, 11, and 13, the 9, 11, and 13 being equivalent to the even numbers we skipped for the most part, 2, 4, and 6, I don't know which of those I can add. I'm kind of in limbo because I have this, it's like a math trick, you know, when you're learning math in grade school and you come up with this cool thing that's a shortcut to the procedure. But the reason they don't teach you the shortcut to the procedure is because it doesn't work all the time, right? If you go to another thing, it's not going to work anymore. So you learn something that only works sometime, which might be cool because you can use it in particular situations. But if you don't know when you can't use it, then you have a problem, right? And you can't use that convention to know the 7, 9, 11, and 13. How could I know when the 7? Well, then we have to learn each of them, right? I'd have to learn each of them by either modal name, or I would come up with a numbering system. So in other words, when I get to this 4 chord, I want to know that I can build a major, I want to know if I build a major third or a minor third. I know it's the 4th, therefore I'm going to have a major third. I'd also like to know the 7, 9, 11, and 13 so that I can build a more complex chord around it if I wanted to, even if I'm playing in the key of C major. So the way I can know that is to know that it's actually a Lydian mode. And when I think of a Lydian mode in perspective to the major scale, so I'm playing in C major, But then I get to the 4. The 4 to me is the Lydian, right? I'm going to call it mode number 4 is the Lydian. So I can call it a Lydian chord, basically. It's a Lydian chord, meaning I have all of these notes available to me, all of these intervals available to me to play something that is in that chord shape that is still in the same key as the related C major. In other words, I'm not switching to F major. I could do that. I could go from C major and then switch entirely not to F Lydian, another major mode that would be in the same key, but to F major, and just change everything, which would be parallel. That would be like a parallel chord construction, because all the shapes would be entirely the same as I go from one to the other. But the other alternative would be I want to stay in the same key using all the same notes as the C major, and then when I go to the 4, I want to play something that is entirely congruent, having the same notes in the C major, which does include the same 1, 3, 5, as though I switched to F major, but doesn't include the same 7, 9, 11, and 13, which is equivalent to the 7, 2, 4, and 6. So in other words, how can I do that? Well, even if I'm playing in the C major, I'd like to be able to say the 1, 4, 5 is really mode number 1, mode chord number 5, mode chord number 4, and mode number 5, which converts to the Ionian, the Lydian, and the Mixolydian. So when I get to the 5, I'm going to say it's the 1, 4, 5. It's also mode 5 or modal chord number 5, which means that's the Mixolydian, right? And that means that I know that I have the 7 has like the dominant 7 in it, right? And all the other intervals are the same. So, and if I do that, if I name these modes and I think of them as modal chords, like this is the Dorian modal chord. This is the Phrygian modal chord. They happen to have the same 1, 3, 5 as a minor because they have a minor third, but they don't have the same 7, 9, 11, and 13 possibly, right? So if I learn them individually, then I have more flexibility to go beyond the 1, 3, 5 when I do chord constructions, even if I'm not playing in Dorian, but I'm just playing a Dorian modal chord is the way I would want to think of it, right? So then if I played, say, in Dorian, then I'm going to use the same numbering system as is compared to the major scale to number the chords. So in other words, if I'm playing in Dorian, same notes over here as D Dorian and C major, but the relative positions have changed. The 1 is not a C anymore. The C is now the 7 because the Dorian starts on relative position 2. So everything's shifted down. So the problem is if I'm in the Dorian, if I'm playing in Dorian, then I say 1, 4, 5. I'm like, okay, I'm going to play the 1, 4, 5 in the Dorian. Well, what does that mean? Because I can no longer use the cheating convention that I can use in C major, memorizing that the 1, 4, 5 are the ones that I can build a major chord from, and the 2, the 2, 3, and 6 are the minor chords. I can't do that, right? Because now the relative positions have shifted. But if I can say that I'm in Dorian, which is modal chord number 2 in relation to the major scale, then I can say, well, I know the Dorian is mode number 2. I can not only know that it's relative position 2, which means I'm going to play a minor chord around it, a minor third, but I also know it's a Dorian, which has the distinctive, I believe, 6th, right? So if I want to build a longer chord from it, and then if I build the 1, 4, 5, what is the 4? Well, the 4 is now the relative position 4 of the Dorian is equivalent to the 5 because everything got pushed down one number. I'm starting on 2 instead of on 1, right? So when I get to the relative position 4 from an absolute modal numbering system, I'm going to call that the 5 as it relates to the major scale. That telling me just from my cheat code, the 5, the 1, 4, 5 has a major chord. That tells me it has a major third, so I can at least build a triad. But beyond that, I want to memorize that it's the Mixolydian, right? If I know it's the Mixolydian, then I also know that what 7 I can put in it because I know the distinct intervals of the 7. So that's what we basically want. One reason you want to learn the modes is to see them as chords, longer chord constructions using all the notes in the chord with that as the root, so that even if you never play like in Lydian, I know that if I'm playing in Dorian or if I'm playing in, say, a minor scale and I get to the Lydian chord, so if I get to an F, if I get to the sixth and I'm playing in A minor, then I know that the sixth, I build a Lydian chord off of it. In other words, right, the sixth is equivalent to mode number 4. So if I'm going to say I'm playing in A minor, I'm playing the sixth of A minor, that would be an F chord. I know that, but I also want to know that what is the relative position? What's the modal chord? The modal chord is what I would call mode number 4 chord, which is the Lydian, which I know that relative position 4 to the major scale has a major third, because the 1, 4, 5 has a major third. And I know also that it's the Lydian mode. It's the Lydian modal chord. So that means that I can go beyond, if I know all of the intervals of Lydian, I can go beyond just building a 1, 3, 5 and build a more complex chord on it. So that's kind of like the idea on why we want to do that. But as we do this as well, we're also just learning the intervals that are applicable to most of the shapes. So you'll note that as we go through the intervals, we're repeating a lot of the intervals, but we're repeating them on each string so that we have different, so that it's different, because when you're looking at a different string, you have a different amount of strings above it and below it. So it's useful then to repeat the intervals. So in other words, as we practice Lydian intervals, we're going to have all of the intervals will be the same as with the Ionian, except for the one interval difference. So that will allow us to reiterate all of the intervals, but on different strings as we go down the different strings, and to identify the differences between the intervals. Remembering the general idea is that if we look at the major scale, the major modes related to the major scale, the Ionian mode, are the Mixolydian and Lydian. They're only going to have one interval difference from the major scale. So the major scale has a 0 note away perfect first, a 2 note away major second, a 4 note away major third, a 5 note away perfect fourth, 7 note away perfect fifth, 9 note away major sixth, 11 note away major 7. If we go to the Lydian, then our point of focus here, it still has a 0 note away perfect first. It still has a 2 note away major second. That's what we would expect in a major scale. Also happens to be the same in a minor scale. And then we have the 4 note away major third. That's what we would expect. That's the interval that makes it a major mode and a major chord construction. But then we have the weird one, the 4, and it's named incorrectly in my worksheet because of the formulas I use. I'm not going to change it, but we have to just note that it says diminished fifth. That's what that stands for. But it should really be an augmented fourth, meaning I'm on the relative position 4. So the distance is 6 notes away. I could call that distance a diminished fifth or an augmented fourth. It should be called an augmented fourth because I need a fourth here, but I'm not going to mess up my formatting in Excel or make a really complicated formula, so we're going to deal with that. And then so that's the one interval that's different. And then we have the 7 note away perfect fifth, the 9 note away major 6. This one is the same on the major and the minor. The 9 note away major 6, which is what we would expect. That's on the major scale. It would be a minor 6 on the minor. The 11 note away major 7, that's what we would expect in a major mode. So notice the Lydian mode, if I measure around this F, it's the same. All the intervals are the same except for the fourth, which this one has an augmented fourth, which has the same distance as a diminished fifth. So if you adjust out one interval, you can easily go then from the F Lydian, which I might know just simply because I know this shape because I play in A minor a lot or in C major a lot. And then I'm saying, if I know this shape, I know that the F is the Lydian. So if I make that the tonic, then I would be playing in F Lydian. What if I wanted to convert to an F major? I should be easy to do that because there's only one interval difference. So instead of me saying well, why don't I make this F like the same on the top here? I could find the F up here and then make this same structure here. That's what most people would do. Nothing wrong with that. But you could also say, I'm going to convert this shape by just basically saying I'm going to take that one interval that's different, the B right here, and it's augmented, so I'll flatten it, right? I can flatten all of these, and then I just converted that shape now to this shape, right? Which I would call position, I think, number 4, right? And so and then that's one way that I can expand from one shape to another. All right, that's enough.